will control the vertical.
Welcome to Anthologic, the TV anthology podcast. I am your host, Mark. Anthologic is a podcast dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the odd of horror, science fiction, and the best of mystery suspense anthology shows and series on TV. Join me as we slip through the cracks of reality to approach the extremes of experience, where we can peruse the stories and art of a sinister fairground of strange and wonderful rides. And now we go on to the show that is the focus of this particular episode. Welcome to this episode of Anthologic with your host Mark. Today we are covering an episode of The Twilight Zone, and indeed not just any old episode of The Twilight Zone, the last episode of Season 1. So this is going to be a little while until we cover The Twilight Zone again. We'll stop it, Twilight Zone, in this season of Anthologic. So this is the last one. For that. This episode is called A World of His Own, and interestingly it's the first time Rod Serling actually appears on screen during an episode, which amazed me because I could have sworn he'd already appeared in some of the early ones, but no, he has appeared on pre-credit sort of introductions and closing sort of details, i.e. after the episode's over, but this is the first on-screen one. Now, we're so used to Rod Serling being on screen, as he does in latest episodes as well, and indeed Night Gallery, that it's kind of hard to imagine people seeing him for the first time. He's so sort of ubiquitous and common. They certainly knew his voice before they saw him, if that was the case. But he does actually appear in this one. Right, so this is a kind of lightweight comedy one. It's kind of fun. I liked it. It was well cast, well acted, well written. Written by Richard Matheson. First aired on July the 1st, 1960, and is called A World of His Own. And I like it's kind of meta. It's fourth wall breaking in some respects, and it's got a slightly more modern sensibility than some of the stuff that was being shown at this time during this era. There's really only three main actors, although Rod Serling does appear. There's Gregory West, a playwright, played by Keenan Wynn, Victoria West, his wife, played by Phyllis Kirk, and Mary, who is played by Mary LaRoche. This is a fairly simple premise. Mr. West, Gregory West, is a playwright, and he's got a very strange dictaphone, which when he gives details into, they come to life. Now, it starts with a man and an attractive blonde woman in a room having a drink, and then we see another woman, dark-haired woman, looking through and looking very peeved. It turns out that is actually the playwright's wife, and the blonde woman is not his wife. So that's what's going on. She bursts in, and the playwright, Mr. West, is all on his own. She's trying to figure out what's going on. Essentially, whenever he describes a character or something into his dictaphone, it comes to life, and that's what he's done with Mary, who he's having a very pleasant time with. She's serving him a drink and making sure he likes it, and very attentive. That's what we kind of see, and this is what he's written. But he destroys her by throwing her in the fire, and there is a point he brings her back to life just to she comes back to demonstrate to his wife what's going on. And she's like, "Oh, please don't bring me back again. I can't bear the fact that you remove me," which is kind of sweet and touching. Richard Matheson had a fun time with this one. He originally wrote it, so it's much more nightmarish. The things the playwright was writing were much more a bit odd and threatening. So the whole vibe had a more nightmarish feel. But they did suggest he'd lighten it up and make it more comedic, which he did, and he feels it was a success. He's happy with the result. And it works well. It's well cast and well acted, as I say. And directed by Ralph Nelson, who's quite a good director of film and TV. He's directed several films. Examples are Requiem for a Heavyweight or Charlie, which actually went on to win Oscars. So, he's no slouch. And it kind of fits the mood. What he does fits the mood. There is one bit that did make me laugh. He actually, to prove his point, he actually writes about an elephant, and they have an elephant present, and it's clearly not a special effect. There's actual elephant in the room, which did make me laugh. They're pushing it out. Maybe they had a bit of budget left, and they thought they would. And there's a little story I read in one of the guides I've got where it talks about the elephant and his trainer turned up, and the elephant guy started making the elephant do weird things like trying to stand on its head and going on 2 feet, and he thought, why is this guy doing this? And then suddenly the elephant pooped quite what is described as a bale of hay. He pooped that much. And then the elephant trainer said, right, he's good for 2 hours. He'll be good for 2 hours. So the director was like, right, we're going to hurry up and get this done in 2 hours. He didn't want that happening on screen while he was recording. So that's kind of fun. So in the end, his wife clearly doesn't believe him, even though he tries to prove it to her. He goes, okay, I will prove it to you. He opens the safe, pulls out a special envelope. In it is a tape, and he says he's got her name on. And she does not believe it. She thinks it's all nonsense, and she throws it into the fire and subsequently disappears. So in the end, he says, I've got to get back, and he starts typing, and he realises he's got a better option here, and actually types up Mary has his wife, and she appears, and they live happily ever after. Great little story, nice little one. Kind of riffed on in other places. There's definitely a story, and I think I may have covered this in an Anthologic. Stephen King did a story, Word Processor of the Gods, in one of his collections. Let me look it up. Which was kind of like this, but a more sinister bent. It was in his collection, Skeleton Crew. And it was done as an episode of Tales from the Dark Side. From 1984, and there was also a similar story in the Twilight Zone 2019 series, which again I've covered, about the comedian that talks about people in his routines who their existence become erased whenever they're part of his routine. So that's kind of a nod too. And there's also, apparently there's a movie with a similar premise called Ruby Sparks. I've never heard of this movie. It doesn't ring any bells. 2012, a comedy drama, which uses this premise. So yeah, it's kind of gone on to influence or be reflected somewhat in other works. So that's kind of interesting. I like this. Oh, and I have to mention that the coda is that Rod Serling talking about them. And he's in the room with the playwright and his new wife. And the playwright's like, no, you don't. He starts to use the word, of course, this ridiculous nonsense. And the playwright's like, you should never use words like ridiculous and nonsense. And we see him throw another envelope in the fire. And Rod Serling starts to fade away with the parting words, well, that's the way it goes. So, there we go. Yes. Quite a nice little ending to the entire season. I thought I quite enjoyed this. It was effective, I think. It's not entirely memorable. It's not up there with the greats. But it was pretty good. Now, so we've gone through 36 episodes of The Twilight Zone. Probably the standout to me is The Monsters on Maple Street, but there are some really good ones in this set. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones I like. The one with Burgess Meredith, Time Enough at Last. That was excellent. But where it falls down, I think, is when it tries to do comedy. Though this episode worked, a lot of the comedy feels a bit forced and not that funny comedy elements. I like it when it's a little more serious. And and depending on the scope as well, the monsters. The monsters are due on Maple Street is probably the high point, and Time Enough at Last, those two. But I quite liked most of these episodes. I really didn't have any problem with much of them at all. The other one I kind of liked, that's slightly lower tier, is I think it was called The Big Tall Wish, about the lad. It had a significant black actor cast that I thought was really good, and it was nice to see such representation of this era, and Rod Serling was quite progressive about these kind of things, and it was just a good episode anyway. I just liked the vibe of it. But there was a few other ones I really liked too. Some of them I've looked through and I have almost no memory of them, so they didn't stick much. But yeah, I thought this was a great season overall. It went on to win many awards. Rod Serling was taken aback somewhat by some of the awards. I remember apparently at one awards ceremony he said something along the lines of, I don't know how I feel about if I deserve this, but I do know how I feel about appreciating it. Something along those lines. Gracious statement. And the series was lauded quite strongly when it came out, and kind of almost, I mean, this is the quintessential anthology series, isn't it? It's still the big one. There's a few contenders, Outer Limits, Tales of the Unexpected, and so on. But when people talk about anthology TV, it's really the Twilight Zone that most people think of. I know there's your Boris Karloff thrillers and your Alfred Hitchcock Presents and stuff like that, but Twilight Zone is the one everyone's kind of tends to talk about. Anyway, I'm going to wind it up there. Before I go, may I ask, is anybody out there?
There's nobody here but us chickens.
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to